I still remember that morning. The latte on my desk hadn't even cooled before everything changed. The media office on the 16th floor of the Slate building, where sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows and lit up every logo on the wall, had once felt like the place where my dreams were growing day by day. I am Bethany Mota, creative director of Stratix Media, a content marketing company in the heart of Chicago. My job was never just about selling ads. It was about telling stories with enough emotional depth to touch people's hearts, to make them remember a brand not because they needed it, but because they felt connected to it. That was what I believed emotional marketing was meant to be, and I had spent nearly 7 years building it here. I didn't come from a family with connections or a head start, but I knew how to tell a story. I knew how to turn an average product into a dream, how to make an unknown brand feel like a cultural symbol. I started out as an intern, writing scripts for small campaigns, and climbed my way up through creativity, precision, and many nights spent at the office long after everyone else had gone home. Stratix was the first place I dared to call mine, and I believed I had built something lasting here, not just with the brand, but with the people. Among those I trusted the most was Emily Rhodes, the deputy executive director. She was the first to believe in my content strategy, my partner during the hardest times, someone I once saw as a sister. Emily had a way of smiling at the right moment, of saying things that made you believe everything would be okay. And I believed her. I shared everything with her, from creative concepts to draft strategies that had never been pitched, because I thought what we had was trust, not rivalry. But maybe trust is the easiest thing to steal in a media company heading into a phase of acquisition and restructuring. That week, I had just wrapped up a campaign for a sustainable fashion brand where we didn't just triple sales, but also built a loyal customer community. It was a project I had poured 2 sleepless months into, from researching consumer behavior to crafting a cross-platform storytelling experience. I remember my heart racing as I stood before the board of our parent corporation. Every chart, every clip, every word blending together into a vivid story I believed would mark a turning point for the company. And it did. 3 days later, the CEO in New York sent an internal memo praising it as the most inspiring campaign of the year, hinting at upcoming promotions among senior leadership. I didn't have much time to celebrate, because the very next day, Emily called a sudden executive meeting and told me I wasn't required to attend. She said it was a finance meeting, unrelated to creative. I found it strange, but I didn't think much of it until Monday morning, when an all-staff email landed in my inbox with a subject line that simply read, "Congratulations to our new creative director, Emily Rhodes." In that moment, it felt like the world around me stopped moving. She hadn't just taken my title. She took the entire campaign I had built, attached her name to every part of it, every success, every idea. I had been betrayed in the most complete way imaginable. No warning, no message, no explanation, just a meeting I wasn't invited to. And then, suddenly, I was cut out of the very project I had created. I went to see the regional CEO with everything I had, every draft, every sketch, even a voice note I had sent Emily at midnight. He listened quietly, then sighed and shook his head. "Bethany," he said, "the company is restructuring for a more stable image. Emily seems to align with that vision." I understood then, in their eyes. I was the risk taker, the emotional one who pushed boundaries. She was the face of safety. That same afternoon, I was officially reassigned to the creative support team. I lost access to strategic resources, I was cut from major campaigns. It wasn't a termination, but it was an erasure. My desk remained, but everything I had built vanished. My new computer held no trace of the files I once worked on. My work email was restricted. Old colleagues avoided my gaze in the elevator. And the worst part was Emily looking at me with pity, as if she was doing me a favor, helping me reset expectations rather than having stolen years of my effort. I went back to my small apartment in West Chicago, where a wall of windows overlooked the red rooftops and blurred golden lights of a bar on the corner. I sat before the blank screen of my personal computer, the same one where I once wrote my first scripts, where I had stored hundreds of untold ideas. But this time, I didn't write anything. I just sat there for hours, listening to the sound of passing cars, rereading the appointment email. I felt myself shrinking, like an idea erased with a single click. What I believed to be real value hadn't been enough to convince those who ran the old company. Trust wasn't lost in a single betrayal. It was lost the moment you realized some people never believed in you to begin with, eventually. I requested 2 weeks off. No one asked why. I understood then that I had become a shadow in a place that once felt like a dream. And then, as if fate wanted one last slap, I got an email from an old collaborator. Attached was a link to an industry article titled, Stratix Media's New Era, How Emily Rhodes is Redefining Emotional Marketing. In it, every quote, every principle, every familiar phrase of mine was repeated. Only now. They were under someone else's name. They had taken my entire story and turned it into their media product. I turned off the screen, pulled an old hard drive from the drawer, and placed it on the table. Inside were ideas no one had ever seen, plans still unfinished, files I had saved with the strange feeling that I might need them someday, for the first time in days. I looked at my reflection without flinching. There was no trembling in my eyes, no tight-lipped pain, only a calm, empty clarity. And I knew then, this fall wasn't the end. It was the silence before something was about to begin. Some moments arrive so suddenly. It feels like someone just turned up the volume on your life, and everything that once felt blurred becomes heartbreakingly sharp. I was walking back to the office after a client meeting when I received an email from Ava Kingsley, Ember's first investor. The subject line was simple: Stratix loses Glinton & Co. Inside was an internal bulletin she had accessed through her investor network, confirming that Glinton & Co., one of the oldest consumer brands in the country, had terminated its contract with Stratix due to a recent campaign being described as emotionally disconnected and conversion ineffective. That brand used to be my client back when I was still at the company. The reason for their departure was clear. As one media director put it, this campaign had no soul. I didn't feel joy or vindication. But I understood that this was the first crack in the wall Emily had built after removing me from the game. The truth is, you can't borrow emotion forever, especially not in the business of emotional marketing. You can steal a strategy, but you can't replicate the heart that created it. What I hadn't expected was that just 1 week later, Stratix lost another major client, the e-commerce fashion platform Nova Grid, which had also been part of my former portfolio. An anonymous insider sent me a recording of an emergency meeting where Emily was being questioned about dropping ROI rates, declining user retention, and customer complaints that the current campaigns lacked any real emotional pull. I didn't need to listen to the entire recording to understand that momentum was shifting. Ember hadn't attacked anyone, but simply staying true to real value was already starting to expose the weaknesses of those who had once betrayed me. Just when I thought things were beginning to stabilize, another twist arrived. On a Wednesday afternoon while I was editing content for a new campaign, Ava called to inform me that a company had just registered a copyright for a product called Ember Pro, described in terms nearly identical to our platform, except for the user interface. I immediately asked our legal team to investigate and discovered the entity behind this move was a newly established subsidiary of a media group in New Jersey, where Emily Rhodes served as a strategic advisor. They weren't just copying the name. They were planning to launch it within 3 months, alongside a major PR campaign designed to push out smaller competitors in the same space. I had prepared myself for many disruptions, but I hadn't expected them to try it again. This time more overt, more calculated. It wasn't internal theft anymore. It was an attempt to replicate my entire model and push it to market under legal cover. We didn't have the resources for an immediate lawsuit, but I didn't stay silent. Instead of retaliating directly, Ava and I decided to strike back by accelerating our current campaign. We launched an expanded beta featuring a new AI storytelling feature and partnered with an independent podcast network to share the stories of founders who had once been cast aside but came back using their own talent. Each podcast episode was a real story. We never mentioned Stratix, never spoke of betrayal. But people in the industry understood my story. Ember's story was told through the voices of end users, from a small business in Kansas to a nonprofit in Oregon. There was no glitter, just honest words about how they used Ember to tell their own stories without needing massive budgets. The podcast spread quickly. Industry news outlets started paying attention, and within 2 weeks, sign-ups for Ember tripled. We didn't need flashy PR because our user community became our most authentic ambassadors. Stratix began to feel the pressure. Emily started showing up more at industry panels, giving interviews that sounded eerily similar to the slides I had presented years ago. But this time, the audience wasn't as easily impressed. A video of her speech at a media summit in Austin circulated with negative comments, criticizing the presentation as flat and repetitive. Industry professionals began to question not Ember, but the actual value behind Stratix's campaigns. Could anyone still feel a soul in them, or were they just industrial imitations of something that once felt real? Right in the middle of that storm, another twist hit. I was invited to speak at a national conference on storytelling and technology, hosted by Civic Lab, a media organization. It was the same event Emily had represented for the past 3 years. This time, I was asked to headline, sharing the journey of building a tech-driven storytelling platform for small businesses. I didn't want to appear publicly, but Ava advised me to go. Not to retaliate, but to affirm Ember's rightful place. After many sleepless nights, I agreed. I understood that sometimes you have to step onto the stage, not to be recognized by others, but to remind yourself how far you've come from where they tried to leave you. The conference was unexpectedly full. I stood backstage, peeking through the curtain at the packed seats, the lights, the microphone, the sound of heels on the wooden floor. All of it reminded me of the last time I stood before the old board of directors, just before they cast me aside like an expendable accessory. But this time was different. There were no skeptical eyes, no judgment. I began with a simple story about the first time Ember was rejected. I didn't name names, didn't mention betrayal. I spoke about the pain of having an idea discarded and the kind of belief it takes to keep it alive in the dark, waiting for the right moment to be seen. The room was silent, not from surprise, but from understanding. They had been there too. After the talk, I stepped down and shook hands, not as a winner, but as someone who had been lost and found a way through. The next day, articles began to appear across media journals Ember, a storytelling platform built on technology and quiet resilience. One article came from a journalist once close to Emily, now writing about people who had been pushed out of the system, but still rewrote their fate with their own hands. Stratix responded by releasing a beta version of Ember Pro. But shortly after, a tech expert found that over 80% of its code matched an open-source framework we had published 3 months prior, under a Creative Commons license that required attribution. The issue spread rapidly in developer communities, deeply damaging Stratix's credibility. Emily held a live stream to explain, but when asked why they hadn't credited the source, she hesitated and deflected, triggering a wave of backlash. The hashtags #ValueFirst and #EmberRealTalk began trending on Twitter and spreading across industry forums. Ember was no longer the underdog. It had become a symbol for those who chose authenticity over spectacle. I sat in our little office in Pilsen as the late afternoon light filtered through old dusty windows, looking out at cars passing by and pedestrians hunched over their phones. I realized something important. Some revenge doesn't need gunfire or verdicts. Some revenge is built through success, through continuing to live and build, while others are left dealing with the mess they created out of ambition. Ember was never meant to be a weapon. It was the result. A result powerful enough to spread without anyone's validation, because it came from something real. Some mornings, you wake up, and that lingering sense of failure no longer clings to your collar. In its place is a quiet clarity, unhurried, unshaken, like the foundation of a building beginning to rise a second time. That morning was just like that. I woke up earlier than usual, not because of any urgent call or emergency email, but because I knew it was time. Ember was no longer a beta test or a survival effort. It was standing on its own. And now, I was ready to step out of the shadows, not to reclaim anything from the past, but to establish what was rightfully mine. I arrived at the office early and reopened the documents that had once been dismissed in previous meetings, long-form proposals on partnership models for training programs, nonprofit storytelling initiatives, and the idea of creating a small academy to teach narrative skills to marginalized women. In the past, they had all been deemed impractical or lacking commercial appeal. But now, in a world rediscovering the human side of media after so many manipulative tactics, this was the moment to bring them back. I made the decision to restructure Ember into something broader, no longer just a content creation platform, but a storytelling ecosystem, a network that would connect independent creators with brands seeking authenticity. I called a full team meeting. There were only 7 of us, full-time and collaborators combined. No fancy outfits, no grand conference table, just wooden chairs, scattered sticky notes, and a projector on the wall. I shared the plan for what we would call Ember Collective, an expanded version with 3 key focuses. First, producing premium content for small to mid-sized businesses using diverse creative talent. Second, launching free online storytelling classes for underrepresented groups, especially women entrepreneurs. And third, developing an ethical media standard where any brand that committed to it would receive 1 year of free storytelling support from us. There were a few surprised looks, but then everyone nodded. They weren't nodding because of me. They believed in what we were building together. Right after the meeting, I sent partnership proposals to 3 companies that had previously turned us down, not out of spite, but because I knew they were now looking for what Ember could offer. 1 week later, we signed contracts with an organic food chain in Minneapolis, a platform connecting single mothers to job markets in Ohio, and a nonprofit supporting domestic violence survivors in Seattle. Each project became a story that could never be duplicated, and with each completion, I felt another part of myself come back to life. News of Ember Collective began to spread after a 3-page feature in an industry journal focused on the integration of emotion and technology in media. One line in the article stayed with me. She didn't take revenge, she changed the game. After that piece, I received a short email from a name that was once familiar but now felt distant. Emily Rhodes. It read just one sentence: "If you have time, I'd like to meet." I read it and didn't reply. Not out of anger. I simply didn't feel the need. That same day, I was invited to a private roundtable hosted by the Creative Media Association, where CEOs gathered to discuss redefining ethical standards in content creation. It was Ava who introduced me. She stood up during the meeting and said, "I think we should hear from someone who was once cast out of the system, but chose to rebuild it from scratch." I didn't have a prepared speech. I brought only a small notebook where I had written down reflections from the time I was pushed aside and slowly found my way forward. I spoke about how true value in media doesn't come from marketing budgets or campaign scale, but from a brand's willingness to listen and share its real story. I spoke about lost trust, not because someone betrayed me, but because I had once allowed others to define what mattered. And I spoke about what a real comeback looks like, not a dramatic return, but the quiet act of continuing in your own way and proving it through results. That meeting changed more than I expected. After my talk, representatives from 4 major companies approached me about restructuring their communication strategies to be more emotionally sustainable. Among them was one name that made me pause for a moment: Glinton & Co. This time, they didn't go through someone else. They didn't make an indirect call. They sent a formal invitation addressed directly to me as the founder of Ember. I sat alone in my office, reading the letter over and over, then typed my reply. Ember is ready if your company is also ready to ask the question, what do you truly want your customers to remember about you that same week? An internal memo leaked from Stratix revealed that the board was considering leadership changes after multiple contract losses and ongoing media crises. A recording showed Emily being asked to explain the repeated use of creative assets without proper attribution, and her team had nearly collapsed under the weight of multiple resignation notices. A former colleague sent me the audio, not to fuel my ego, but to let me know that when value is misrepresented long enough, it eventually collapses from within. I listened, then deleted the file. I was ready to move on. Without looking back, that afternoon I cleaned my desk. A new team member asked me, "Do you think you'd ever go back to the old company if they asked?" I smiled and pointed to the wall, where we were planning to launch a new media scholarship for high school students in underserved neighborhoods. I answered as calmly as I could. There's no need to go back to the place that pushed you out when you're busy building a new one for others who've been pushed out too. That night, I sat alone, opened my laptop, and began typing the first lines of a new document. Not a strategy, not a pitch deck, but the opening to a small book I had always wanted to write, a kind of guide to emotional storytelling, not just for marketers, but for anyone who had ever been dismissed or made to feel voiceless. I wrote, "A story is not something you tell to earn approval. A story is what you hold on to remind yourself how far you've come." When people talk about a comeback, they often imagine someone stepping onto a stage to thunderous applause, a spotlight casting sharp light across their face, a triumphant moment framed like the climax of a film. But for me, the comeback didn't happen inside any cinematic frame. It happened on an ordinary Monday morning, in a 10-square-meter meeting room where the sunlight spilled softly through dusty windows. I stood there with the Ember team, presenting to the board of Glinton & Co., not with fancy words, but with data, with the stories of real users whose lives had been changed by the platform we built. We didn't claim to be better than anyone. We simply showed how we created real impact in real communities with real messages. The meeting ended in silence, followed by a brief applause, not loud, not showy, but honest. A week later, they signed a 3-year contract with Ember to restructure their entire communications strategy. I didn't post about it, didn't share anything online. We quietly carried out the work, improving the AI technology built into the platform, retraining our storytellers to meet the new ethical standards we had set. Meanwhile, news began to surface on industry channels that Emily Rhodes had stepped down from her executive position at Stratix. An investigative article confirmed that several of the company's projects had been suspended due to internal conflict, and key personnel had resigned en masse following a content copyright scandal. Emily remained silent, offered no comment, no statement, no press conference. Everything unfolded quietly, the way truth often finds its way back. Once, after a conference, I walked into the lobby of a hotel and saw Emily sitting alone. Her eyes had lost their usual light, her hands resting on a phone she wasn't using. When I passed by, she looked up and our eyes met, like brushing against an unwelcome memory. I nodded slightly, not out of bitterness, not to provoke, just to acknowledge the end of a chapter. She didn't say anything, and I didn't stop walking. We passed each other like two people who once knew, once shared, once hurt. Then each chose a different path that would never cross again. In the months that followed, Ember grew not through explosive pace, but through lasting relationships. We were invited by universities to speak about storytelling in the digital age. Nonprofit organizations asked to use the platform to train underrepresented communities in media skills. Small and mid-sized businesses began to see Ember not as a vendor, but as a partner walking with them to help tell their stories. We never aimed to build an empire. We just wanted to be a home for voices that had been ignored. One day, Natalie Brooks, the former assistant who had sent me the first audio recording, stopped by our office to say thank you. She now worked for a female-founded startup and told me that what happened back then made her reevaluate her own worth and choose a different path. Before she left, she said something I'll never forget. Not everyone can get up and build again from the ground, but you did, and because of that, others believe they can too. I didn't know what to say. I just smiled and thought that maybe revenge through success isn't about watching someone else fall, but about standing up in a way that makes others want to stand with you. One of Ember's biggest projects came later, with an educational technology company. We were tasked with redesigning the entire communications experience for a STEM program aimed at girls in rural communities. It wasn't the most lucrative contract, but it was the project that most clearly reminded me why I had started this. I remembered being removed from the Strategy Council for proposing media support for education initiatives deemed commercially unviable. And yet, here it was, becoming reality through the very model I had rebuilt from the ashes. Not long after, I received a formal invitation from the board of a national media academy, nominating me as a content advisor. The letter was signed by someone who had once opposed my ideas at the old company. I didn't decline. I also didn't see it as a victory. I accepted because I knew that if I could sit at that table now, then maybe someone else like me, with an unheard idea, might be given a chance. I still lived in my old apartment on the west side of Chicago, where morning light reached the small kitchen and touched a vase of fake flowers that was always watered anyway. I hadn't moved into a penthouse. I didn't buy a new car. I only replaced my coffee machine with one that kept the brew warm a bit longer. The biggest changes hadn't happened in the outside world. They happened in how I viewed it. I no longer feared loss. I no longer felt the need to prove anything. I just needed to keep working, keep telling stories, and keep choosing truth, even when it was uncomfortable. One late autumn night, I sat down to write my speech for an upcoming TEDx event. The theme was Real Value in the Digital Age. I began with a question. What happens when you're pushed out of the place that once meant everything to you? And I ended with a whisper just loud enough to hear. You rebuild, but this time you're the one holding the pen. I don't believe I can teach anyone anything. But if someone out there has ever been cast aside, told they were too much or not enough, or too emotional to be taken seriously, I want them to know that sometimes those very things are what make the difference. And if you're patient enough, quiet enough to hear your own voice again, you'll realize you were never truly defeated. I stood on that small stage, the spotlight not too bright, the microphone carrying a slight hum, but I saw the eyes of those sitting in front of me. A young woman nodded when I spoke about lost trust. A middle-aged woman wiped her tears when I described having your work stolen and being unable to fight back. I didn't ask who they were. I didn't need to, because I understood. Everyone carries a story, and sometimes all they need is for someone to stand up and speak theirs first. When I left the auditorium, light rain was falling. I opened my umbrella and walked slowly to the car. No fireworks, no cheering, just the steady sound of footsteps on wet pavement and a calmness spreading through my chest. I thought about everything that had happened, and I felt only gratitude, because the pain had taught me how to stand firm, how to build not to prove, but to connect, to nourish, to exist kindly in a world that's not always kind. Maybe I never won in the traditional sense, but I became the person I once hoped to see back when I sat alone in that old office, clutching a hard drive and trying to protect one small idea in a storm of doubt. And if anyone ever asks what my greatest success is, I won't say it was the biggest contract or the moments I was recognized. I'll say it was keeping my voice intact, even after someone tried to steal it. I don't know what exactly pulled me out of that suspended state. Maybe it was the sound of birds tapping against the window each morning, or simply the hollow feeling of watching days pass without leaving any trace. After 2 weeks of sitting quietly in my apartment, I began to fear the silence itself. There was something inside me that hadn't gone out completely, like an underground current still moving beneath the surface. I remembered a line I once wrote in a strategy proposal: the brands that truly reach people's hearts are the ones that dare to tell their real story. And if I couldn't even tell mine, then everything I had once believed in would mean nothing. I reopened my old hard drive, not to search for achievements, but to see who I had been and what I once wanted when I started. Those old files appeared like a worn-out map pointing back to where I had gone astray. There were unreleased presentation slides, midnight voice notes, and a folder titled Ember. It was an idea I had conceived back at Stratix, a content platform for small businesses to communicate their core values through emotionally driven campaigns, not cold advertising, but real stories told through new technologies like AI, voice synthesis, interactive video, and behavioral analytics. But the idea had been dismissed as unrealistic. Back then, I thought they were right. But now, with everything taken from me, I saw Ember differently. No more restrictions, no one to interrupt and tell me it was too emotional or too hard to scale. For the first time, I had the freedom to choose. I started again from nothing. Reaching out to Ava Kingsley, a former Stanford classmate now leading an angel fund for female founders in creative tech. Ava wasn't someone I would call a close friend, but she was someone I remembered clearly when life fell apart. I didn't beg, didn't ramble. I simply sent her a brief summary of Ember and said I needed a chance to pitch. 2 days later, I stood in a small conference room with soft yellow lights, presenting Ember with everything I had left. Ava didn't nod immediately, but she looked at me with a kind of recognition I had longed to see in others. It wasn't pity. It was the look of someone who had once fallen and knew when someone else was trying to rise. A week later, I received my first round of funding. It was just enough to operate for 3 months, hire 2 collaborators, and lease a small old studio in Pilsen that used to be an art space. I didn't reach out to former colleagues or friends from the old company. Instead, I chose 3 strangers, a young designer from Montana, a self-taught programmer from a Mexican family, and a former social worker who could write better scripts than any professional copywriter I had ever met. We worked in a dusty space with sunlight filtering through frosted windows, sitting on plastic chairs around old tables. But every meeting started with one question: what story are we telling today? We built everything from scratch. No one had heard of Ember, and no one cared who you were unless you delivered value. Some weeks I stayed up until 3 a.m., rewriting code or rebuilding storyboards because the client didn't feel emotionally connected. Some days we had to scrap entire projects because partners ran out of funds. I had to relearn how to talk to investors, how to manage cash flow, how to say no to hollow partnerships just to survive. There were moments when it felt like the whole thing would collapse, like the night we had just enough in the bank for 2 more weeks of salaries and our only project was canceled last minute due to a client strategy shift. That night, I walked home like a shadow and stopped at an old cafe on Clark Street. It was cold outside, light rain falling, while inside the shop glowed with warm orange lights and the scent of toasted cinnamon. I sat alone, holding a paper cup tightly as if to draw back some kind of warmth. A man at the next table recognized me after a few minutes. He had once been the content director for a sustainable cosmetics brand I worked with, now turned freelance consultant. We talked, not long, not pretending. When I told him about Ember, he paused, then asked, "Would you be open to a trial project? It's small, but if it works, we might scale." I didn't ask for details. I just nodded. That project, a storytelling video series for a skincare brand supporting women affected by cancer, became Ember's first turning point. We told real stories. No actors, no scripts, just women speaking about their skin, their bodies, their pain, and their healing. The videos spread on their own. No ad budget. Small press outlets wrote about them. Then larger marketing sites picked it up. From one test run, we received 6 collaboration offers within a month. Ember began generating steady revenue, and I started seeing the light return to my team's faces after each meeting. I never spoke of the old company. I didn't post anything on LinkedIn or social media, not because I was afraid, but because I wasn't ready. I didn't need to announce a comeback. I just needed to keep building, one day at a time, in alignment with what I believed had real value. But no matter how much distance I tried to keep, the media world in Chicago wasn't that big. One day, I received a message from Natalie Brooks, who had been Emily's assistant at Stratix. It simply read, "You need to know this." Attached was an internal recording in which Emily admitted she was basing current campaigns on old materials I had created. Not just one, but several projects were receiving poor feedback for lacking emotional depth, and Stratix had started losing major clients to competitors who were crafting stories that truly resonated, the very kind they had once thrown away. I turned off my phone and looked out the window, where the light from a street lamp cast a soft glow across the wooden table. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm, because for the first time in weeks, I knew I was moving in the right direction, not by outpacing someone else, but by holding firm to the path I had chosen. Ember was no longer a forgotten idea on a hard drive. It was real, present in every project, every story, every person. I hadn't made a grand comeback, but I was rebuilding from the roots, not with noise, but with quiet resolve. And I knew then that what truly lasts is never born out of chaos, but from the long days you endure in silence and still choose to keep going.